I was sitting in my office when my phone started buzzing, and it didn't stop one call after another, 99 missed calls from numbers I hadn't seen in over a decade. And when I finally looked at the screen, I saw her name, the woman who told me I would come crawling back, the woman who laughed in my face as I stood on the porch with nothing but a bag of clothes and $20 in my pocket. My mother, and now she was calling me again and again, desperate, begging me to pick up, but I just sat there watching the screen light up because I remembered everything. I remembered the night she threw me out, the way she said, "You'll be back begging in a month," the way my father slammed the door so hard the windows shook, the way my brother stood behind them with that smirk on his face, and I remembered walking down that dark street alone with nowhere to go. No one to call, nothing but the clothes on my back, and the sound of her laughter echoing in my head. They thought I would break. They thought I would crawl back and beg for forgiveness. They thought wrong because 11 years later, I built a life they never imagined. I became someone they never expected. And now they needed me. They needed me more than they ever knew. But what they didn't realize was that I knew their secret, the one they buried the night they threw me out, and this time I was the one holding all the cards. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I am 32 years old, and I am an estate planning attorney with my own practice, a woman who built everything she has from nothing, starting from the night my family threw me away, like I meant nothing at all. To understand why my phone was lighting up with 99 desperate calls from people who hadn't spoken to me in over a decade, you need to understand what kind of family the Whitmores really were. Because from the outside, we looked like the American dream. A respectable middle-class family with a nice house and a nice neighborhood, the kind of people who went to church every Sunday and volunteered at community events and smiled for photographs at every holiday gathering. But inside that house, there was a different reality, one that no one outside ever saw, because in the Whitmore family there were two kinds of children. There was my brother Daniel, the golden child, the firstborn son, who could do no wrong, and then there was me, the quiet one, the invisible one, the daughter who was never quite enough, no matter how hard she tried. I learned early that my needs did not matter in that house. I learned to stay quiet, to take up as little space as possible, to never ask for anything, because asking only led to disappointment. When I graduated from high school with honors, my mother did not attend the ceremony because Daniel had some kind of crisis that required her immediate attention. I never found out what it was, probably another one of his schemes that needed covering up, but I sat in that auditorium and watched other mothers cry with pride while my seat remained empty, and I told myself it was fine, that I did not need her there, that her absence did not hurt. My achievements were always dismissed as expected, nothing special, just Eleanor doing what Eleanor was supposed to do. But Daniel's failures were treated like natural disasters, unavoidable tragedies that required the whole family to rally together with money and support and endless second chances. He dropped out of college twice, crashed 2 cars, lost 3 jobs, and every single time my parents wrote checks and made excuses and told everyone that Daniel just needed a little more time to find himself. Then my grandfather died and everything changed. Grandpa was the only person in that family who ever made me feel seen. He used to tell me that I was smart, that I was capable, that I would make something of myself one day. And he promised me, he looked me in the eyes and promised me that he would make sure I got my education, that he had set aside money just for me. So when he passed away, I was heartbroken. But I also believed that at least this one thing would be different, that at least his final gift would be honored. But a few nights after the funeral, I could not sleep, and I walked downstairs to get some water, and I saw my brother Daniel in our father's office standing at the copy machine feeding documents through it with shaking hands and a nervous look on his face. He did not see me watching from the shadows, and I did not say anything. I just went back to bed with a strange feeling in my stomach that I could not name. A week later, my parents gathered the family and announced that Grandpa had left everything to Daniel because he was the only grandson, the one who would carry on the family name, and I sat there in shock, because that was not what Grandpa had told me, that was not what he had promised. So I asked my mother a simple question. I said, "Did Grandpa really change his will because he promised me he would help with my education?" And the moment those words left my mouth, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. My mother's face transformed into something I had never seen before, rage and fear, and something else, something that looked almost like panic, and she screamed at me, called me ungrateful, called me a liar, told me I was tearing the family apart with my accusations. That night I was thrown out of my home with nothing but a bag of clothes and the sound of my mother's voice telling me I would be back begging within a month. My father closed the door without saying a single word to me. I did not know it then, but I was not kicked out for asking a question. I was kicked out because I asked the right question and they could not risk me asking another. The first 3 years after that door slammed shut were the hardest years of my life, and there were moments when I truly believed my mother might be right, that I would break, that I would crawl back and beg for forgiveness just to have a roof over my head. I couch-surfed with friends from high school. Until their parents grew uncomfortable with the situation, I worked 3 minimum-wage jobs at the same time just to afford a room in a boarding house that smelled like mold and despair. I ate ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches because that was all I could afford, and I learned what it meant to be truly alone in this world. The worst part was not the poverty or the exhaustion or the hunger. The worst part was learning what my family had told everyone about me, because through old acquaintances and mutual connections, I discovered that my mother had rewritten the entire story of my departure. According to Margaret Whitmore, I had run away from home because I could not handle responsibility. I was a troubled teenager who rejected her loving family. I was unstable and ungrateful, and probably on drugs, and she was the heartbroken mother who had done everything she could to save me. No one questioned her version of events. No one reached out to ask if I was okay. No one wondered if there might be another side to the story, because the Whitmores were respectable people, and I was just the difficult daughter who had thrown away every opportunity she had been given. I was erased from the narrative of my own life, and for a long time, I did not know how to write myself back in. By the time I turned 20, I had been evicted from my apartment because I could not make rent after losing one of my jobs, and I found myself sitting on a park bench in the middle of the afternoon with everything I owned in a duffel bag at my feet, wondering if this was the moment I finally gave up and went home to beg. I was so tired of fighting, tired of proving myself, tired of being hungry and scared and alone, and I thought maybe my mother was right. Maybe I was not strong enough to make it on my own. Maybe some people were just meant to fail. That was when an older woman sat down on the bench beside me, a woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from a lifetime of seeing the world clearly. She did not ask me what was wrong. She did not offer me money or food or empty words of comfort. She just looked at me for a long moment and then said something that changed the entire course of my life. She said, "You look like someone who has been told their whole life that they are not enough." I started crying right there on that park bench, ugly sobbing in front of a complete stranger, because no one had ever seen me that clearly before. No one had ever named the wound that I had been carrying since childhood. Her name was Helen Brooks. She was a retired judge, and she had spent her career watching families destroy each other over money and pride and the need to control. She told me that she recognized the look in my eyes because she had worn it herself once a long time ago when her own family had cast her out for refusing to be who they wanted her to be. And then she gave me the best advice I have ever received. She said, "Do not fight them, outgrow them." Helen did not give me money. She did not offer me a place to stay. She did not try to fix my problems for me, because she understood that what I needed was not rescue. What I needed was opportunity. She got me a job as a legal assistant at a law firm where she still had connections, an entry-level position with long hours and modest pay, but it was stable work, and it was a start. I discovered something unexpected in that job. I discovered that I was fascinated by estate law, by wills and trusts and inheritance protection, by the legal mechanisms that families use to pass down wealth, and the ways those mechanisms could be manipulated and exploited. Maybe I wanted to understand what had been stolen from me. Maybe I wanted to make sure it never happened to anyone else, or maybe I just needed to believe that there was justice somewhere in this world, even if I would never see it for myself. I worked during the day and studied at night. I took out loans and lived on almost nothing. I pushed myself harder than I had ever pushed before, and after years of sacrifice and determination, I earned my law degree. Helen's philosophy became my own. The best revenge is living well and letting them watch. By the time I turned 30, I had my own practice specializing in protecting vulnerable people from family exploitation. I had built a reputation as someone who fought for those who had been cheated and manipulated and cast aside by the people who were supposed to love them, and I had done it all without a single word of support from the family that had thrown me away. I stayed completely off social media. I never reached out to anyone from my past. I let the Whitmores believe whatever they wanted to believe about me because I knew that someday the truth would come out and I wanted them to understand exactly what they had lost. Helen asked me once if I was hiding or healing, and I told her I was doing both for now. For 13 years, they assumed I was somewhere struggling, too ashamed to show my face. I let them believe it because when the truth finally came out, I wanted them to understand exactly what they had thrown away. The email arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, sitting in my inbox between client consultations and court filings, and I almost deleted it because I did not recognize the sender's name. The subject line simply said, "Regarding your grandfather, Harold Whitmore." And something made me pause. Something made me click on that message instead of sending it to the trash, and in that moment, everything I thought I knew about my past began to unravel. The email was from a woman named Laura Mitchell, and she wrote that she had been my grandfather's personal secretary for the last 10 years of his life, that she had been searching for me for over a decade, that my mother had told everyone I had disappeared without a forwarding address, and that she had finally found me last month when she saw my name in a legal journal. I had won a high-profile inheritance case for a family named Martinez, protecting a young woman from relatives who had tried to cheat her out of her grandmother's estate, and Laura had read about it and known immediately that Eleanor Whitmore, the estate attorney who fought for the vulnerable, had to be the same Eleanor Whitmore who had vanished from her family's life 15 years ago. She ended the email with words that made my hands tremble as I read them. She wrote, "There is something you need to know, something your family has hidden from you for 15 years, and if you are willing to meet with me, I can show you the truth." I met Laura Mitchell at a quiet coffee shop 3 days later, and she was exactly what I expected a legal secretary to look like: professional and precise and careful with her words, a woman in her early 50s who had clearly spent decades managing sensitive information for powerful people. She had a manila folder on the table in front of her, and she kept her hand on it as she spoke as if protecting something precious. She told me that my grandfather had loved me, that he had talked about me constantly in his final years, that he had worried about me because he could see how my mother treated me, and it broke his heart. She told me that in the months before he died, he had come to her office and asked her to help him update his will, and that he had been very specific about what he wanted. He had left the family home to my parents. He had left some personal items to my brother Daniel. But he had set aside $200,000 in a trust specifically for my education money that was meant to give me the freedom to become whoever I wanted to be. His last words to Laura, the very last thing he said to her before he went into the hospital and never came out, were, "Make sure Ellie gets her education. She is the only one who will make something of herself." Laura slid the manila folder across the table to me and told me to open it, and inside I found 2 documents that shattered everything I had believed for 15 years. The first was my grandfather's original will, the real one, the one that clearly stated $200,000 was to be held in trust for Eleanor Marie Whitmore for educational purposes. The second was a copy of the will that had been filed with the probate court after my grandfather's death. And even with my untrained 17-year-old eyes, I would have been able to see that the signature was wrong, that the handwriting was different, that someone had forged my grandfather's name on a document that erased me completely from his final wishes. But I was not 17 anymore. I was an estate attorney who had spent years studying exactly this kind of fraud, and I could see every detail of the forgery, every mistake, every telltale sign that this document was not legitimate. Laura watched my face as I examined the papers, and then she told me the rest of the story, the part that hurt the most. She told me that my mother had discovered the original will before it could be filed, that Margaret had realized her own father had chosen to invest in the daughter she considered worthless instead of the son she had always favored, and that she had been furious. Laura told me that Margaret had orchestrated everything, that she had instructed Daniel exactly what to write, how to copy his grandfather's handwriting, how to forge the signature, that my mother was the mastermind, and my brother was simply the tool she used to steal my future. Laura had kept the original will hidden for 15 years, waiting and hoping to find me because she had made a promise to a dying man and she was determined to keep it. I sat in that coffee shop with the evidence of my family's betrayal spread out before me, and I did not cry, I did not scream, I did not feel the rage I expected to feel. Instead, I felt something cold and clear settle into my chest, a kind of certainty that I had been right all along, that my instincts that night when I saw Daniel at the copy machine had been correct, that the question I asked my mother had been the right question, even though it cost me everything. I asked Laura why she was coming forward now after all these years, and she told me something that made the irony almost unbearable. She told me that Daniel had invested the money he stole from me, all $200,000, into real estate ventures that had completely collapsed, that he was now over $500,000 in debt, that my parents had co-signed his loans, and they were all facing bankruptcy, that they might lose the family home, the same home they had thrown me out of with nothing but a bag of clothes. Laura said she had heard through old connections that the Whitmore family was desperate, that they were looking for legal help, that they needed someone who specialized in estate law and financial crisis management. The family that had stolen my inheritance now needed the exact skills I had spent 15 years developing without their help. As Laura finished speaking, my phone began to buzz on the table, and then it buzzed again and again and again, notification after notification lighting up the screen until I picked it up and saw what was happening. 99 missed calls, voicemails piling up one after another, messages from numbers I had deleted from my contacts years ago. My mother, my father, even Daniel, who had not spoken a single word to me since the night I was thrown out. They were all calling, all desperate to reach me. I listened to one voicemail from my mother, and her voice was nothing like I remembered. There was no coldness, no contempt, no superiority, just raw, desperate pleading as she said, "Eleanor, please call back. We need to talk. It is urgent. Please, honey." Honey. A word she had never once used with me in 17 years of living under her roof. I thought about Helen's advice, whatever you decide, make sure it is your choice, not their desperation. And I thought about the statute of limitations that had long since passed on the forgery, which meant I could never take them to court for what they had done. And I thought about the $200,000 that had been stolen from me and wasted on my brother's failures. For 15 years, they had the money that should have been mine. Now, they needed the skills I built without it. The statute of limitations meant I could not take them to court. But I realized something. As I sat there with the truth finally in my hands, the law could not give me justice, but the truth could give me something better. I drove to the house I had not seen in 15 years, the house where I had grown up invisible, the house where I had been thrown away like garbage, and I parked my car on the same street where I had once walked alone into the darkness with nothing but a bag of clothes and a broken heart. The neighborhood looked exactly the same manicured lawns and friendly facades, the same illusion of perfect American families living perfect American lives, and I wondered how many other secrets were hidden behind those clean white doors. I sat in my car for a long moment, holding the manila folder with the original will inside, and I thought about what I was about to do, not to destroy them, not to save them, but to finally set myself free from the story they had written about me. I was not the troubled daughter who ran away. I was not the ungrateful child who could not handle responsibility. I was Eleanor Whitmore, estate attorney, a woman who had built everything from nothing, and I was about to reclaim my own narrative. My mother opened the door before I could even knock, as if she had been watching from the window, waiting for me to arrive like a rescue ship on the horizon. She looked older than I remembered, her hair grayer, her face more lined, but her eyes were the same, calculating and controlling even in desperation. She started speaking immediately, not a greeting, not an apology, not even a moment of acknowledgement that she was seeing her daughter for the first time in 15 years, just the same old Margaret trying to take control of the situation. She said, "Eleanor, finally, we have been trying to reach you as a lawyer. You can help us with this situation. Daniel has gotten into some trouble, and we need someone who understands these things." I let her finish. I let her say every word without interrupting, and then I looked at her and said, "Hello. Mother, 15 years. Not even a 'how are you?'" The expression on her face shifted confusion mixing with irritation, because this was not how she had expected this conversation to go. I was not playing the role she had assigned me. I walked past her into the house, into the living room where my father sat, slumped in his chair looking defeated, and my brother Daniel stood by the window, looking everywhere except at me. And I placed the manila folder on the coffee table and said, "We need to talk about grandfather's will." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard in that house. I watched my mother's face as she looked at the folder, watched the color drain from her cheeks, watched her eyes dart to Daniel, and then to my father, and then back to me, calculating, always calculating, trying to figure out how much I knew and how she could spin this to her advantage. I opened the folder and spread the documents across the table, the original will and the forged copy side by side, and I said, "I know everything." I told them I knew that grandfather had left me $200,000 for my education. I knew that my mother had discovered the will and decided that her precious Daniel deserved that money more than I did. I knew that she had orchestrated the entire forgery, telling Daniel exactly what to write and how to copy grandfather's signature. I looked directly at my mother and said, "You did not protect the family. You protected your favorite child, and you used your own 23-year-old son to commit a crime because you could not stand the thought of your father choosing me over him." Margaret tried to speak, tried to interrupt, tried to take back control the way she always had, but I held up my hand and said, "I am not finished." For the first time in my life, I watched my mother fall silent because she had no choice. My father started crying, quiet tears running down his weathered face, and he said the first words he had spoken since I walked in the door. He said, "We did not have a choice. Eleanor, you have to understand, we did not have a choice." I turned to look at him, this man who had closed the door in my face without a single word of goodbye, this man who had let his wife throw away his daughter to protect a lie. And I said, "You had every choice, Dad. You had every choice, and you chose him. You chose Daniel over me every single time, and you do not get to pretend that you were powerless." Daniel finally spoke up, defensive and angry, saying that none of this mattered, now that the past was the past, that what they needed was help with the current situation, and could we please focus on what was important. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. My brother, who had stolen my inheritance and never lost a moment of sleep over it, standing there telling me that my pain was not important, that his financial crisis was the only thing that mattered. I told them I was not going to report the forgery to the authorities because the statute of limitations had passed years ago, and I watched the relief flicker across my mother's face before I continued speaking. I said that I had conditions, 3 of them, and they were not negotiable. First, Daniel would handle his own debt without any more bailouts from our parents, no more sacrificing their retirement, no more mortgaging their assets to save him from his own failures. He would face the consequences of his choices like an adult. Second, my mother would tell the truth to her church community and her women's club, the same people she had lied to for 15 years, the same people she had told that I was a troubled runaway who had broken her heart. She would tell them what really happened, and she would do it publicly. Third, I would be sending a copy of the original will and the forged document to Daniel's creditors, because they deserved to know the character of the man they were dealing with, and because consequences were not revenge, they were simply the natural result of choices. My mother started to protest, started to say that I was being unreasonable, that I was trying to destroy the family, and I cut her off and said, "No, Mother, I am not destroying anything. I am simply refusing to protect you from the truth anymore." Laura had given me one more thing before I left our meeting, a sealed envelope that she said my grandfather had written for me before he died, a letter he had asked her to deliver to me personally, but had never been able to, because I had vanished. I pulled that envelope from the folder, now my hands trembling slightly, as I broke the seal and unfolded the paper inside, and I read my grandfather's words aloud so that everyone in that room could hear them. To my granddaughter Eleanor, he had written, "You are the only one in this family who sees things as they are and not as others want them to be. That is a gift, and it is also a burden. I have watched your mother try to diminish you your whole life, and I am sorry I could not protect you from her, but I believe you will become someone extraordinary, not because of this money, but because of who you already are. I love you, and I am proud of you, and I know you will find your way." I looked up from the letter and saw my mother's face, saw her hearing for the first time how her own father had seen her, how he had known exactly what she was doing to me and had tried in his own way to give me an escape. The silence in that room was devastating, and I let it sit there, let them feel the weight of what they had done. I did not destroy them. I simply stopped protecting them from themselves, and when Daniel asked about the money, whether I would take it back, I gave him an answer he never expected. Daniel stood there in the living room of our family home, surrounded by the wreckage of 15 years of lies, and he asked me if I wanted the money back, if I had come here to demand repayment of the $200,000 that should have been mine. I looked at my brother, really looked at him for the first time in 15 years, and I saw a man who had been given everything and had squandered it all, a man who had never learned to stand on his own because our mother had always been there to catch him, a man who was now facing the terrifying prospect of consequences for the very first time in his life. I told him to keep it, and I watched the confusion spread across his face, across all of their faces, because they had expected me to demand what was owed, to fight for every dollar to try to reclaim what had been stolen. But I said, "Keep the money, Daniel. I do not need it anymore. That $200,000 was supposed to give me a future, and it did. Just not the way any of you planned. I built everything I have without your help, without grandfather's money, without a single word of support from this family, and that is worth more than $200,000 will ever be." My refusal was not forgiveness. I wanted them to understand that clearly I was not forgiving what they had done. I was simply declaring that I no longer needed anything from them. Not their money, not their approval, not their love. I had become complete without them. And that was my victory. 6 months have passed since that confrontation, and I have watched from a distance as the consequences of their choices finally caught up with them. Daniel was forced to sell his house to pay his creditors the beautiful home he had bought with money that should have funded my education, and when the sale was not enough to cover his debts, he had to declare bankruptcy. His wife, who had enjoyed years of living beyond their means, filed for divorce the moment she realized there was nothing left to take, and for the first time in his entire life, my brother had to find a job and support himself without anyone to bail him out. I heard through Laura, who still kept me informed about the family, that he was working as a sales associate at a furniture store, that he was living in a small apartment on the other side of town, that he looked tired and defeated in a way he had never looked before. I did not feel joy at his suffering. I did not feel the satisfaction of revenge. I simply felt the quiet acknowledgement that this was what accountability looked like. This was what happened when a person finally had to face the results of their own choices. My mother's fall was different, slower, and more public, exactly as I had intended. I sent copies of the original will and the forged document to the pastor of her church and to the president of her women's club, the same communities where she had spent 15 years portraying herself as the heartbroken mother of a troubled, runaway daughter. I included a letter explaining what had really happened, how she had orchestrated the theft of my inheritance and then thrown me out of the house when I asked questions, how she had rewritten the story to make herself the victim and me the villain. The response was everything I had hoped for and nothing I took pleasure in, because within weeks, Margaret Whitmore went from being a respected member of her community to being the woman who had stolen from her own daughter and covered it up for 15 years. She was asked to step down from her committee positions. Her friends stopped returning her calls. The reputation she had spent decades building crumbled like a house built on sand. I did not destroy her. I simply told the truth and let the truth do what truth always does when it finally comes to light. My father sent me a letter 12 pages long, written in his shaky handwriting, filled with apologies and explanations and pleas for understanding. He wrote that he had always known what Margaret was doing to me, that he had seen the favoritism and the cruelty and the way she diminished me at every opportunity, but that he had been too weak to stand up to her, too afraid of conflict, too committed to keeping the peace at any cost. He wrote that closing the door on me that night was the worst thing he had ever done, that he had replayed that moment in his mind thousands of times over the years, that he had never forgiven himself, even though he had never had the courage to find me and say so. I read every word of that letter. I sat with it for a long time, and then I put it away without responding. Some apologies come too late to heal the wounds they are meant to address, but that does not mean they are worthless. It simply means that acknowledgement and reconciliation are not the same thing, and I could accept one without offering the other. The last time I heard from my mother was 3 months after the confrontation, a phone call that came late at night when I was sitting in my office finishing paperwork. Her voice sounded nothing like the woman who had controlled my childhood. There was no authority in it, no manipulation, just a kind of bewildered confusion that I had never heard from her before. She asked me one question, the question that I think had been haunting her since the night she threw me out. She asked why I had not come back begging like she said I would. I thought about all the ways I could answer that question, all the things I could say to hurt her, to make her understand the depth of what she had done. But in the end, I chose something simpler and more honest. I told her that she had taught me something that night, that when she threw me out and told me I would be back, begging within a month, she had taught me that I was on my own, that I could not rely on my family, that I had no one but myself. I told her that I had taken that lesson, and I had learned to be enough on my own, that I had built a life and a career and a sense of self-worth that did not depend on her approval or anyone else's. I told her thank you for that lesson because without it, I might have spent my whole life trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it. The call ended, and I sat in the silence of my office, and I did not feel triumph. I did not feel satisfaction. I felt something better and quieter and more precious. I felt closure. I established a scholarship fund in my grandfather's name last month, a fund for young women who were told they were not enough. Young women who were dismissed and diminished and made to feel invisible by the people who should have loved them most. It is not a large fund, not yet, but it will grow, and every year it will help someone like me find their way to an education and a future. I told Helen about it over dinner, and she smiled that knowing smile of hers and said something I will never forget. She said, "You did not just survive them. Eleanor, you outgrew them, and that is the rarest and most beautiful kind of victory." My relationship with my family now is not hatred. I do not waste my energy on hating them. It is simply boundaries, clear and firm and permanent. I did not close the door on them. I simply stopped standing at their door, hoping to be let in. I stopped waiting for an invitation that was never going to come. I stopped believing that I needed their acceptance to be whole. My mother told me I would come back begging. 15 years later, I came back. Not begging, not broken, not bitter. I came back whole, and that was the only revenge I ever needed. If you have made it to the end of this story, I want you to know that Eleanor's journey is not just about revenge or justice. It is about something far more important. It is about learning that the people who were supposed to love you do not get to define your worth. It is about understanding that sometimes the greatest victory is not destroying those who hurt you, but simply outgrowing them and building a life so complete that their absence no longer leaves a hole. So many of us have been told we are not enough. So many of us have been dismissed and overlooked and made to feel invisible by the very people who should have cherished us. And if that is your story too, I hope Eleanor's journey reminds you that their words do not have to become your truth. You are not what they said you were. You are not the narrative they wrote about you. You are whoever you choose to become when you finally stop waiting for their permission to be whole. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think about your own journey or the boundaries you need to set in your own life, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this one. Leave a comment below and tell me, have you ever had to walk away from family to find yourself? Have you ever been underestimated by people who later regretted it? I would love to hear your story, because every single one of you matters, and your experiences deserve to be shared. Thank you for listening, thank you for being here, and remember, the best revenge is not hatred. It is becoming someone they never imagined you could be.